Thanks very much. I should explain that outburst. He blessedly did not say the most embarrassing thing about me, which is in 2008, I ran for governor of the state of North Carolina as a third-party candidate, as a libertarian, and I discovered that generally the only way I could get applause was to lead them myself. So it's a pleasure to be here. Some 10 years ago, I started thinking a lot about the problem of how often it is that I teach at Duke. I've been teaching at Duke now for almost 25 years. And a lot of the students that I encounter as first years are from elite high schools. And I ask them in the first couple of classes when they're freshmen, well, can someone summarize the argument for markets? Can someone give me the reason that some people advocate for capitalism? Now, that doesn't mean that those arguments are correct. But what I want to be able to do is to start with the argument for capitalism. So I worry that we have not done a very good job in making sure that people know the argument for capitalism. And one of the things that I admire about the Center for Study of the Government and the Individual at a university is that it makes possible events like this where we can have a discussion about those arguments on their merits. They're presented by someone who advocates for them, and we're going to hear some alternatives and questions. But second, I myself have begun to worry that capitalism is actually not sustainable in a democracy. And a lot of people on the right, I notice, tend to make rather extreme assumptions about how capitalism ought to work. And their defense of capitalism relies on those things actually being true when they're demonstrably not. And that means that a lot of the criticisms that the left has taken for granted for a long time that have been ignored by those of us that are for markets need to be taken more seriously. So that's what I'm going to try to advocate for in this talk, is first explain why it is that I think the argument for markets is one that people should take seriously. And then second, why is it that the argument that capitalism becomes a distorted, perverted version of itself called cronyism? Why it is that cronyism is actually a likely consequence. Now, in 1944, Friedrich Hayek published a book called The Road to Serfdom, in which he said there is a tendency in central planning to metastasize outside of its original boundaries. And the result can be a cascade of regulations to fix the distortions that are caused by the initial set of attempts to plan. If you use central planning on pricing, you end up having to regulate other things where the distortions are introduced. I think a modern-day Hayek might write a book called The Road to Cronyism, where capitalism in a democracy tends towards cronyism. And so the question that I have for defenders of capitalism is, when you see cronyism, can you show me an example of a country that's a democracy where cronyism is not now rampant, where many of the problems that we observe have to do with people in power who are able to manipulate the market system to their benefit? And if that's true, then capitalism in the form that we teach it in microeconomics class, that is its pure form, may not be sustainable. So there's the summary of the talk that I'm going to give. This is a question that's gone on for a long time in political theory and the worry about virtue. So the question is are markets consistent with virtue? So Cicero, in Of Duty, wrote about Quintus Scaevola, son of Publius. He asked to have the price of an estate that he was buying named once for all. The seller had complied with his request. He said he thought it worth more and added 100,000 sesterces. So I spent about 10 minutes on Zillow this afternoon looking at Colorado Springs, forgive me, that's a terrible thing to say, Colorado Springs real estate, and was looking at 3-bedroom condos, and it's pretty hard to find one less than $300,000. So suppose I go to someone and they have a condo, and I say, look, I want to buy it. How much do you want? And they say, well, $260,000. And I say, no, that's not enough, $300,000. Said, no one ever. I mean, after all, the seller gets to say. So this is what's interesting. What Cicero observed is no one would say this was not the act of a good man. That is, a good person might say, no, it's worth more. But men in general would not regard it as the act of a wise man, any more than if he'd sold the estate for less than it would bring. And then here's the surprising part. This then is the mischievous doctrine regarding some men as good and others as wise. So the question that this poses is there just an irreducible conflict in a capitalist system between being good and being wise? If that's true, then we have a problem. So I'm going to argue that there need not be, but that there often is in a crony system. So I have a theorem. I'm catechized as an economist, though I have long been apostate. But if exchanges are voluntary, now voluntary is a word that I've written about in philosophy journals, means truly voluntary. So often there's a problem with exchanges where differences in bargaining strength or wealth maybe make it not voluntary. So there's a set of conditions. But if exchanges are truly voluntary, then by definition, both parties to the exchange are made better off. And if profits are the excess of revenues over cost in a market without artificial constraints, that is, markets are the result of me making voluntary contracts with all my input suppliers, all of whom are better off by having made that transaction, and then my revenues are the result of selling my products in a series of voluntary exchanges. Now, if that's true and I have some money left over, then profits are a sign that I have created a lot of value in the economy. And if that's true, then entrepreneurship is always virtuous. It is the habit of the alert seeking of exchange opportunities embedded in a character of forbearance of rent-seeking opportunities. Now, rent-seeking is something that public choice theorists often talk about. Rent-seeking is the pursuit of artificial gains. And you might think of it this way. Most businesses, when they're first starting out, are probably investing in more engineers, more workers to produce things, and more marketing people to get the information to the public. At some point, though, it is likely that you can increase your profits by starting to hire lawyers and lobbyists. But lawyers and lobbyists are just getting subsidies, favorable tax policy, and restrictions on competition and entry. So the point is, capitalism works well as long as profits are the result of the pursuit of entrepreneurship. As long as you're hiring engineers and not lobbyists, there's an argument for capitalism. The question is that sustainable? Don't all businesses at some point, don't all the firms that we see, people talk about the fact Microsoft didn't used to have any lobbyists, now they have an entire building on K Street. At some point, you can make more profits by selling to the government for subsidies than you can by selling voluntarily to consumers for prices. And so that's the perversion, is when capitalism becomes cronyism. But this is the argument for markets. So the problem is sustainability. Now suppose I'm an owner or manager of a corporation, and I say we could make a lot of money by investing in lobbying and getting favorable treatment, favorable tax policies, that we don't have to pay taxes like other corporations do. There's all sorts of policy we can use our money to buy better policy from the government. But I think that's wrong and I'm not going to do it. Is that sustainable? Well, there's a market for managers. That company can hire another manager that's perfectly happy to. And what would be their reason for doing that? Well, why would you say you refuse to do this? It's legal. You just say it's immoral. We will find someone who lacks your qualms. We will find someone who is wise, but not good. And there's a market for managers. You can find someone who does that. Suppose, though, that stockholders say, nope, we also think that it's immoral. We think that you should leave money on the table. Legal money on the table. In that case, there's the mergers and acquisitions market. I, a corporate takeover artist, recognize that your stock price is undervalued. I can go to a bank and borrow against the increment to your stock price that I expect. There's going to be a capital increase as a result of investing, and I'm using investing in quotes, investing in favorable treatment from the government. So when I do that, I can pay a premium over your current stock price. Your capital, in a sense, is underemployed. And then I will spend money on lobbyists, and I'll be able to pay back the loan I used to acquire your company. So there's two parts of the logic of the competition of capitalism that work against it. The market for managers and mergers and acquisition mean that capital is probably at some point going to be devoted to the higher profit use. The problem is the higher profit use is likely to be cronyism. So I hesitate to use this because you're going to recognize the provenance of it. It's as if capitalism contains certain contradictions that mean that over time it is self-destroying. Just as Karl Marx said. Karl Marx said that it contained those kinds of contradictions. And my claim is that pro-market people need to take that argument more seriously rather than dismissing it. Because what do we usually say? Oh, that's not capitalism. That's cronyism. Okay. And that's what all capitalist systems become. So we have to take it seriously. So depressed share prices, stockholder lawsuits, the market for managers, increased accounting profits, all those things are the result of this kind of competition. So you may remember from Star Wars, when Grand Moff Tarkin got the bad news. Guy comes in, we've analyzed their attack, sir, and there's a danger. Should I have your ship standing by? And Governor Tarkin is dismissive. Evacuate. In our moment of triumph, I think you overestimate their chances. Now, if I were Governor Tarkin, I would say, why the hell is there a hole in our ship that goes straight to the central reactor? Y'all didn't notice this before? You had to analyze their attack to realize that a hole that goes straight to the central reactor is a problem? But he didn't say that. He said, no, we're in good shape. And of course, he died. So, my friends on the left, when I say, look, socialism doesn't work, and you can tell, Venezuela. Venezuela is empty shelves. So, socialism, or even an attempt to have something like price gouging laws. In North Carolina, we have price gouging laws. So after a hurricane, you can't raise the price of necessities. So there's an old North Carolina joke about this. So after a hurricane, a lot of people need ice and water. So some guy goes into a store, and they have cases of bottled water. But it's $30 for a case of bottled water. And the guy's outraged. $30? That's incredible. You shouldn't be charging that much. The guy down the road has water for $7. And the owner says, well, all right, go buy it from him. Well, they're out. And the owner says, I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. As soon as I'm out, I'll charge $7. So the point is that price is a way that the market system allocates resources in the face of scarcity, and it's indispensable. We can't do without it. So the thing about socialism is prices are really low, but the shelves are empty. Because there's no way of signaling we need more of this stuff. So I think Venezuela is socialism. On the other hand, a lot of my friends on the right, if someone says, so this was on Medium, in my opinion, the most important problem of capitalism that you didn't mention is lobbying. And immediately the person says, oh, that's not capitalism. It's cronyism or corporatism. It's the opposite. It has nothing to do with capitalism. So someone said Betsy DeVos is going to have one company that's going to handle all student loans. Come on, that's not capitalism. That's crony capitalism. So the point is, always, that's not capitalism, that's cronyism. But what if cronyism is an essential feature of any democratic system that tries to be capitalist? And all I do here is list three of the fundamental assumptions of the public choice approach. Public choice approach says you cannot rely on good people or virtue to solve the problems. You have to have good rules. You can't rely on good people, you have to have good rules. And the claim is that a market system is good rules. Well, if voters are mostly passive and rationally uninformed, they don't necessarily know that much about the alternatives presented. If individual politicians benefit from cronyism and individual corporate CEOs benefit from cronyism, the only hope would be for one of those to act morally. One of those then to display virtue, saying, I refuse to participate in this legal, profitable, but immoral system. So that's virtue. And that means that that's the one thing that public choice is not supposed to invoke. Now, it's interesting, and I actually think we might take the problem of virtue a little more seriously. One of the criticisms of liberalism is that it has tended to say everyone can act in any way that they want and the system will somehow take care of it. Adam Smith famously said, people of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public. All right, so if all you do is quote this part, it looks like that's pretty cronyist. But what Adam Smith said then is, the law can't hinder people of the same trade. So I wanted to give the entire quote in context. The reason this is important is Adam Smith is saying, the government has to be careful not to give capitalists an opportunity to collude to try to raise price. People, by their nature, are likely to be competitive, but if they meet in groups, they're likely to try to cooperate. The reason I quote this at some length is that Adam Smith is assuming good people are running in politics. Now, that's one of the things that the public choice, now that could be, I hope it's true. But if it's not, it means that someone could read this as a how-to manual. So if I wanted to create a setting where businesses collude and collaborate, all I need to do is have a bunch of trade associations and requirements that they get together on insurance and statutory requirements on standards. That means that the state has both the interest and the capacity to nudge capitalism in the direction of cronyism. It's in the interests of democratically elected leaders to nudge the system towards cronyism. So a public-spirited government official won't require meetings or trade associations, but you can't defend capitalism by assuming a benevolent dictator. A democratic state will always want to make such assemblies necessary, which brings us to Grand Moff Greenspan. So now the commander comes in. We've analyzed their attacks, sir, and assuming altruistic CEOs is silly while making a benevolent government violates basic public choice theory. Should we admit that capitalism is unsustainable? Well, this is an actual quote from Greenspan. It's called Alan Greenspan's Mea Culpa in 2008 after the financial meltdown. Those of us who look to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. I still do not fully understand why it happened, and obviously to the extent I figure out where it happened and why, I will change my views. Well, he thought that the threat of bankruptcy and the loss of financial reputation would be sufficient to discipline the large financial firms on Wall Street. Turned out it wasn't, because many of you know the problem. If I owe you $1 million and I go bankrupt, I'm in trouble. If I owe you $100 million and I go bankrupt, you're in trouble. So if I owe you enough, now your interests are to bail me out. So the assumption that we could rely on that system to discipline people meant that we were ignoring the incentives for profit. The profit maximizing thing to do was to leverage yourself to such an extent that you were able to be pretty sure that you would be bailed out. So if that's true, Alan Greenspan is taking this back. How are we to think about the way to discipline large corporations? Well, capitalism is a social system based on the recognition of individual rights. Corporatism is a social system where the government intervenes aggressively into the economy, typically with political instruments that benefit large corporations and enterprises to the detriment of small businesses. So the question is capitalism, to the extent that it even exists, is it sustainable? So I have a very good friend who was the CEO of BB&T, a large bank in North Carolina, South Carolina. So John Allison was the CEO of BB&T. And in 2008 and 2009, he received quite a few visits from people at the Treasury Department saying that, well, we all understand that the financial industry was so screwed up that everyone is going to need to receive TARP funds. So TARP is Toxic Asset Relief Program. But BB&T had divested itself of all the mortgage-backed securities by the end of 2006. So he had thought, this is a terrible idea. Let's not hold any of this toxic paper. So he said, no, we're good. It's okay. And the guy at the Treasury Department said, I don't think you understand. This is a nice little bank you got here. It'd be a shame if something was to happen to you. You know, like accidents, they happen. An audit, a fire, who knows why this happens? We can protect you. So John finally accepted TARP funds. So even someone, and now I'm going to claim, and I have a bias, I said he's my friend, but my claim is that you have a corporate CEO that's saying, look, this is wrong. We're not going to accept these interest-free loans. But the state had interests in ensuring that he had to. So my point is not to cast blame. Maybe you think the problem is inherent in capitalism. Maybe you think the problem is an overreaching state. The point is, either way, capitalism is not sustainable in a democracy. So the point is not blame. The point is how to fix the problem. So two examples that are commonly used were Solyndra. Now, as far as I know, Solyndra actually never produced and sold any solar panels. They did have an amazing climbing wall in the employee cafeteria. And they spent nearly $1 billion in subsidies. So they're a very successful company. A lot of people at Solyndra got rich. They just didn't actually make any green energy. But they sold stuff to the government in the form of subsidies. And then Daraprim and some of the other things that Martin Shkreli was famous for. Martin Shkreli bought up some companies and then dramatically raised the price of the pills that they sold. How was he able to do that? They weren't under patent. These were generic pills. Well, what had happened was that the Obama administration had said, we have insufficient regulatory control over generic drugs. So we're going to do two things. First, in order to produce generic drugs, you have to have a license from the FDA, which takes nearly 2 years to acquire. And second, you have to contact the other producers of the drug and get them to agree that there's insufficient production capacity. Well, what Martin Shkreli did was he bought these up and then opposed the petitions to delay anybody else from being able to produce generic drugs. So that's not my first reaction is, that's not capitalism. Well, maybe not, but it's smart as hell. He didn't go to jail for doing that. He went to jail for doing a bunch of other stupid stuff. There's nothing illegal about what Martin Shkreli did. In the system, it was the way to make profits. Now, people at the FDA say, well, we never thought that would happen. Well, maybe, but then you're idiots. Because what you've done is create a legal way for someone to charge a much higher price for a generic drug, the point of which was that it's no longer under patent. So, my thesis was, businesses maximize accounting profits, revenues minus expenditures. If those revenues are voluntary transactions and those expenditures were voluntary transactions with input suppliers, then those profits are actually virtuous. But they don't have to be. Politicians seek to maximize power, including, but certainly not limited to, re-election probabilities. And voters are poorly organized and poorly informed, again, rationally, because there's a collective action problem. So if I spend a lot of time, some of you may have had this experience, I spend a lot of time acquiring information and I reach the conclusion that that person is not the best person to lead the country. Damn it, it happens anyway. You have relatively limited control over what happens, particularly in presidential elections. In some sense, your vote doesn't matter at all. No electoral college race has been determined by a single vote. Florida in 2000 was still determined by 500. Now, we should vote. It's an important thing to contribute to. But should you acquire enough information about whom you're voting for? Or should you rely on party or friends? Well, if that's true, it means that it's very hard to run on a pro-market, as I found out, it's very hard to run on a pro-market platform. So those three assumptions are pretty standard public choice tenets, but taken together, they mean capitalism is unsustainable and it converts to cronyism. So I've said this a couple times, but let me give a better definition. Profits are the excess of revenue from selling a product after costs are subtracted. If the exchange is voluntary, each person buying the product must think that she or he is better off. Entrepreneurs then seek profits, and therefore they try to create value. And generally, when people talk in favor of markets, that's as far as they go. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about entrepreneurship. Fair enough. The good action and the wise action are the same under those circumstances. Rent-seeking, though, is a competition for an artificial prize or benefit that's created either by taking money from taxpayers or trying to give it away, or a restriction of competition that allows an artificial increase in prices. So political entrepreneurs seek rents and no value is created. But it may very well be more profitable to seek rents than it is profits. And the question is, how can we avoid that problem? So when we look at honest profit in a simple economics class, we're going to say that it's revenues, which is price times output, minus what we pay for capital, minus what we pay for labor. So if you look at any of those, you say, well, all of those are going to be determined in a market setting. And again, in microeconomics class, you go through this, all of these are determined in a market setting. We draw the conditions that show that this is producing the maximum utility and welfare for the society. On the other hand, the price, the regulation of production conditions, the regulation of my ability to purchase capital and labor, the interest rate and the wage rate are all things that can be manipulated by the state. Which means that on all these different margins, all of these different things, and these are boring as hell. So you have a lobbyist, and some of y'all may be lobbyists. We need lobbyists. We can't do without them. I love y'all. Y'all are great. But still, when you think of a lobbyist, got $1,200 Italian shoes, really nice suit. When they shake hands, they do it with both hands, and they're making a little more eye contact than you're really looking for. Damn, you look good. Have you lost weight? You know, you and Alice and I and Shirley, we need to get up to Vail again. That was really fun. How are the kids doing at Yale? I understood that one of them got one of their term papers done by my assistant. I hope that worked out. Oh, by the way, that thing we were talking about, that little tiny provision in the 2000th line of the regulation that seems to be a general change in economic regulation, but actually will benefit my company. You taking care of that? Good, good. All right, let's talk about that Vail thing some more. Very difficult to prevent that from happening. And I want to claim, some of you may disagree, and I'd be interested to hear about that. I want to claim that the defense, that's not capitalism, is not good enough. Because that's still where capitalism goes. And in fact, it is where a rational capitalist will go, in the sense that pursuing profits that way gives me more profits. So a rational economic actor will recognize that the marginal profitability of rent-seeking exceeds the returns to the pursuit of the honest profit. Now, I realize I'm making this argument in a fairly technical form, but it's actually important to recognize that it fits in a very congenial way. It articulates in a very congenial way with the logic that we usually teach in microeconomics class. Even if entrepreneurs forbear, a rational politician will recognize that power and electability can be improved by forcing a rent-seeking society on entrepreneurs. So there's a marginality condition. If you invest in engineers and inventors, and you invest in lobbyists and rent-seeking specialists, until the last dollar devoted to each produces an equal increment, the only way capitalism can survive is if the last dollar devoted to honest profit is still more profitable than the first dollar devoted to rent-seeking, because we're on the road to cronyism. So it's a pretty standard graph. If we have marginal profitability on the vertical axis, on the horizontal axis in investment spending. So we have, if this is the way the marginal investment curve works, then capitalism can survive forever. This is the first dollar reward to lobbying. And I think it's plausible to say that there's a kind of life cycle in industries. So what happens is that a new industry, at first, is competitive, and they can make substantial profits by investing in new plant and equipment, new products, better ways to make things, and invent new products. But at some point, the first dollar to lobbying is more profitable than the last dollar they spent on capitalism. And they rationally turn in a cronyist direction. So if that's true, one answer that some people give is we need to make it so the state can't do that. And in fact, it might be possible to have restrictions on benefits that the state can offer, limit the tax benefits that the state can offer. But think about what you're saying. What you're asking is current members of the House and Senate who benefit from this system to say, all right, I will do the right thing instead of what's good for me. It's possible that some of them will do it, but it's unlikely that a majority will. So William Baumol, in a famous paper in 1990 in the Journal of Political Economy, said, the total supply of entrepreneurs varies among society. The productive contribution of the society's entrepreneurial activities varies much more because of their allocation between productive activities such as innovation and largely unproductive activities such as rent-seeking or organized crime. This allocation is heavily influenced by the relative payoffs society offers to such activities. This implies that policy can influence the allocation of entrepreneurship more effectively than it can influence its supply. Now, a lot of people, when they look at developing nations, say that there's not enough entrepreneurship in developing nations. That's not true. Everybody in developing nations is an entrepreneur. They're always working on new hustles, new ways to make things. It's just that almost all of the ways that are available to them are some form of rent-seeking because there's insufficient protection of property rights. There's not a monetary or financial system that allows them to define and borrow against their profits. Their ownership of these things, in fact, is tenuous. It's not even clear they really have full ownership. So there's plenty of entrepreneurships in developing societies. But we can suffer from the same sort of debilitating disease if we allow a turn towards cronyism. So, a hopeful note, one possibility, is that the U.S. economy is large and dynamic enough that we will continue to have new industries in the sharing economy, maybe new industries that use smart contracts, blockchain, things that are beyond the normal way of doing business that mean that there will be intense entrepreneurial activity. So long as we can continue having new productive industries that come up that replace the loss of dynamism in the existing industries, we still have a shot. But it's very tempting to regulate those too. And so we're seeing an arms race between the ability of entrepreneurs to think of new ways, of new industries. So my most recent book was on the sharing economy. My next book will be on blockchain and smart contract applications. If you ever bought a house, there's a bunch of people in the room, and you're tempted to say, who the hell are you? Well, I'm the lawyer that represents something and something and something. So there's like 8 or 10 different groups that have to sign off. If it were possible for us to execute contracts without that level of requirements, then we might be able to regain enough dynamism in some parts of the economy that we can at least balance those out. But I am worried that two things, as I said at the outset. First, we're tending towards cronyism at a level that I don't think most people recognize. There's a sclerosis in many of our large industries, a lack of dynamism, even though they're still profitable because it is possible to use cronyism to get profits from taxpayers. The second thing is I don't think that argument, which has long been made by the left, is taken seriously enough by defenders of markets. So I want to urge people who consider themselves to be defenders of markets to actually work directly on that challenge and to admit that a lot of the people on the left we have long dismissed have made an important criticism that we need to take seriously. Thank you for listening.